I'm Justin Glaw, writer and journalist, and I've spent my career chronicling the violence, unrest, and chaos of American life. On this podcast, I'll discuss the events roiling this complex and troubling country and speak with some of the people trying to make sense of the madness that pervades our world. This is American Doom. Hey, what's up? Justin Glaw here with American Doom. Today I'm talking with Mike Wendling of the BBC, who covers what really everybody covers at this point, I think, which is elections and misinformation and far-right extremism and that whole sort of toxic stew of all of that stuff sort of wrapped together. The reason that I wanted to talk with you, Mike, is because, obviously you and I cover a lot of the same stuff, but you also, you're one of your most recent stories focused on threats to election workers, and it was like super detailed, and it talked about threats in a lot of different places, and it's very detailed in terms of the specificity of the threats. So I was hoping you could just sort of like catch us up to speed on what you found in that story and what these workers are facing, and sort of like maybe if you learn anything about what we can expect post election.
Yeah, sure. I think it's helpful to sort of like rewind to like 2020, right? Because what happened there largely happened after the election. So you remember the election workers who were threatened in Georgia, for instance, at the big count in Atlanta, or scenes outside Detroit, and in big cities. So in this story, I found that has kind of diffused essentially uh, along with Donald Trump continuing to repeat this fiction about winning the 2020 election. That has become a almost like a central plank of his campaign, right? And it has caused his supporters to latch onto that idea all over the country. And so I went to rural Western Wisconsin, a place that is very Trumpy in terms of voting, very Republican. Maybe not a place where you would think that people would say, "Hey, elections here are rigged." It's the kind of place that has been steadily more trending to the Republicans in recent years, and yet there is still these conspiracy theories floating around. And the effect of these conspiracy theories is to make people distrust in the election system. And in these edge cases, in some extreme cases, you have people who are marching into polling places and saying, "Hey, where's your machine hooked up to the internet? I need you to open the back of it." Being aggressive, being threatening. We've also had incidents in other places where election workers are maybe not getting confronted face to face, but they're getting sent white powder through the mail. They're getting death threats. This is happening across the country in various different places. And in places that personally, before I started reporting on this, I found that it was surprising that it was happening in these places, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That's always like an interesting little wrinkle, is when there is like hardcore election denialism in like really, really red places. Like you were describing in Wisconsin. What I've found when you mentioned that, what I thought of is a lot of the election denial officials that I talk to, when you talk to them about their claims about election fraud, a lot of times they'll be like, well, in our county, we think everything's okay. It's the other
Mm.
places that we're worried about. We're worried about Milwaukee or Detroit or Philadelphia, right? Like these Democratic strongholds, big cities, minority populations, all of that. But that's interesting that, even in the red places that you're talking about visiting, people were like, yeah, we don't really trust this. I maybe want to come back to that, but I also want to point out before I forget that, what was it, a few days after, maybe a week after you wrote this story, we have a guy in Arizona arrested for some pretty extreme threats to election officials. I think this was also the guy who was putting powder around signs that said like Dems lie. It's sort of like signs against the Democratic Party, right? Isn't that the same guy? Anyway,
Well,
I'm
yeah.
sure that you know about that case.
Yeah, I mean, it looks very extreme. Obviously, allegations not been proven in a court of
Yeah.
law yet, but it does look like there was I think it was a pellet gun, like a BB gun that was
Right.
shot at local Democratic Party office. Um, these are kinds of things that are happening. It's not. It's also not confined to um, specifically to elections, um, or specifically to um, solely elections, right? Because I spoke to a man who was arrested in North Carolina for threatening FEMA workers, for instance.
Mm.
And if you don't think that's part and parcel of this whole
Mhm.
operation, well, it is, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
on your point about the, the people who think that it's happening somewhere. Now, I actually in the place that I visited for this particular story, Jackson County, I did speak to the Republican county chair, and he said exactly what you said. He said, here it's fine. In
Mm.
Milwaukee, I'm worried. In
Yep.
Madison, I'm worried. Those Democratic strongholds in Wisconsin. However, I have been to other places, and the one that comes to mind is last summer I went to a place called Indianola in Iowa. Again, a place that is it's sort of a suburban and exurban of Des Moines. So it's pretty red. It's trending more red over the years. Um, the county clerk who was appointed at the time did say that initially. He said, I'm worried about what's happening in Georgia or Detroit, not what's happening here. But then he carried on to say, however, there's some interesting things that are happening here, and that's why I got into public service. Now, he legitimately thought that he was doing a good thing by rooting out these rumors, right? Then that's what all
Mm.
they were. They were rumors of vote fraud at the local level. Um, but it was clear as I spoke to him more and more that he was being motivated by the message that was coming from the top. And the message that comes from the top is you cannot trust the elections. People are cheating and they're
Mm.
stealing your vote. And once you get into that mindset, you just see it everywhere. And that's what we're seeing online right now. We're seeing loads of examples of this kind of thing. And it's starting to my mind, I'm trying to sort of do a bit more reporting on this. To my mind, it's starting earlier and with a ferocity and volume that we hadn't seen before, even in 2020.
Yeah, that's interesting. As you were talking about that, the guy in Iowa who gets involved to sort of, in a way, it sounded like he was trying to say he was trying to tamp down maybe on some of the misinformation and stuff. It reminds me when I first started reporting on local election denial officials, people would ask me like, well, once these people got in, right, and they got on the election board and they started seeing behind the curtain of the nuts and bolts of how all of this worked, didn't they begin to understand that there really is no real way for there to be a widespread conspiracy of election fraud? And I mean, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, I would have said yes, I think for some of these people. But now what I'm seeing is people who have had time under their belt working as local election officials who are still hammering away at trying to prove it. They're trying to find the fraud, they're trying to find the evidence still to this day. And like that's kind of what you're talking about is like it's sort of already begun, right? Like and we talk about pre-bunking misinformation. Election denial officials are doing a pre-bunking of their own, really, which has already begun in terms of calling the election into question, right?
I think you're going to really find like this is where the rubber hits the road in the next couple of weeks because right now you can go online and you can watch what's happening in Maricopa County, right? You can watch people open up those absentee ballots or take delivery of them, whatever they're doing. I'm not actually sure. I haven't actually watched it myself, but
It
there
seems
are.
really boring. Like I don't want to
It's
sit
boring.
there.
It's super
It's
boring.
boring. I don't want to do that. Like I have lots of other things to do than watch a bunch of people in a tabulation room open ballots.
Yeah, but they will they will. There are groups that are
Yeah.
recruiting people and pointing people to these links. So, and they will. And the key thing here is, that's just one example of a transparency initiative where, this has happened all over the country. Like election workers all over the place tell me this. Um, we're trying to show these people that we're not out to cheat. We're not out to steal. This is our job. we're trying to sort of open the doors, right? Um, and um, it remains to see whether the people who believe in these conspiracy theories will be convinced, right? Like, I think it's possible, and certainly it's very civic minded to say, "Hey,
Sure.
we're going to show our work here." On the other hand, it may not work.
Right. And also it could backfire. Like I just had a crazy thought of like, when I first started doing national level reporting stuff, it was police shootings, right? And like back then in 2013, 15, 14, like the body cam policies of law enforcement agencies were not what they are today. Like somebody would get shot and killed by cops and it would be weeks or months or years, and in some cases it still is, before we got the anyway. So it's like, and then they started releasing it more quickly, and there's still a lot of work to be done on that front. But for big cities, this turned into this situation where like someone would get shot by a police, and the police were trying to be transparent about it, and they were trying to be like, look, here's the video. And like even some of the ones that were like super obviously justified, like the guy had a gun and he was pointing it at the cops or whatever, people would still rip that video apart and they'd be like, well, the cop could have done this, And I'm not saying that's right or wrong or any, I'm just pointing out that like if election deniers want to find something to criticize in the endless hours and hours and hours of footage coming out of Maricopa County, they're going to find it, right?
Absolutely, yeah, and you hit the nail on the head, really. Um, Video can be interpreted one way. I mean, we've seen examples. We have examples of this. Oh, here's some guy who's behind the civic center or the convention center, and we got video of him. We
Mhm.
have I saw one the other day. A postman outside back of the post office, and what's in the bag that he's throwing out? Well, yeah, it could just be like old ripped up envelopes, right? Like
Mhm.
post offices produce garbage, right?
Mhm.
Like any other
Yeah.
office.
Right,
Um,
right.
but it's immediately jumped to that. I'll give you another example. A story that's breaking like just now, a few hours before we're talking. In Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the authorities there have found some suspicious registration
Yep.
forms,
Yep.
and at the press conference, which I just watched, um, the authorities are saying, look, we caught these, right? This is
Yeah.
an example of the system working
Right.
because somebody, and it's very unclear at the moment who um, eh, submitted these potentially fraudulent voter registrations. So they're saying, but we caught these. And of course, that is not the narrative online and certainly
Mhm.
not in election denial groups and
Right.
accounts online. They're saying, look, here's more proof that elections are fraudulent. So
Right.
that is a definite possibility that all this work around transparency could indeed backfire in that way.
Right. It's that, and I just saw the Lancaster thing. And for anybody who's watching this or listening to this, it's I don't even think it's worth getting into the specifics at this point because it's so raw and fresh. We don't know what the hell is going on there, but they stopped what looked like a few hundred improper or potentially illegal registrations, right? Like forged registrations. Like I filled out a registration that said I'm Mike Wendling and I'm not, right? Like
Right.
that's basically what happened. Who we don't yet know who did it. It sounds like there was a canvassing group that was paying people to register people to vote, which I think is illegal. Like, isn't that what Elon Musk is sort of getting in trouble for right now? Anyway, I mean, what you described though is that this is already being taken because the election denial movement is extremely online. But when you were talking, it just sort of like dawned on me that we're just, people talk about being in the post fact world. Like I think we're just in like a hyper narrative world where like whatever the situation is, really any side, left, right, whatever, can take it and they can make it their own however they really want to, because everybody is so siloed in their information ecosystems that like The people who are election deniers will never see the actual full news conference of the Lancaster County District Attorney where she's explaining this. And the people who are not election deniers will see that and they will have factual information, right?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, or they might watch it, and like there's some masochistic people who are interested in watching this for fun, who who don't like me get paid for it, right? Um,
uh,
and they may watch it and they may say, um, well, they aren't answering all the questions, and it's a
yeah,
conspiracy and a cover up, in that to that degree. You know what I mean?
right,
I can completely see that as a not legitimate, but an election
right.
denialist sort of reaction to that.
I
So
want to
yeah,
go ahead.
I
Go
was just
ahead.
going to say that in some cases it's so baked in
Mhm.
that the only thing that might really, as I sort of talk about this now, the only thing that really might convince some of these people is if Donald Trump came out and said this
Right,
election was fair.
right.
Um, and I think in that case, maybe you would see a lot of this melt away. You'd still have people who, believe it or would think that Donald Trump is a deep fake or whatever. You know what I mean?
Right.
But that's kind of where the stage we're at right now.
Yeah, that's such a super good point because, the way that I've begun to think of it is that these people will not accept any results showing a Trump loss. And they really will not accept any form of election administration that is not up and down from top to bottom, handled by people. There's a litmus test here, right? For what deniers want in terms of the people who administer their elections. And if you don't pass it, you are not allowed in. And in that way, it's sort of in line with a lot of the authoritarian stuff that's happening right now on the right, where it's just like, if you're not for Trump and for America, you're a traitor. You know what I mean? Like that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Like, and that's been the whole point all along. If Donald Trump would just play by the rules and like call an L, then like we wouldn't be in this situation because people aren't this motivated on their own. It's the fact that they've been egged on. And to the point, like as one of the things that's like mentioned in your story, talking about Maricopa County. I mean, they've had to turn Maricopa County into like a jail for the election workers. I mean, there's barricades out front. There's like they're in a barbed wire chain link fence where they're counting the votes in that little area where it's being recorded. And all of this has been because of the threats coming from the election denial movement. What, if anything, did you learn in the process of reporting on this story, which everybody should go read, that gave you some clues as to what we might expect? Is it lone wolf attacks? Things like that. Is it people taking ballots so that they can't be counted, or people showing up like they did in 2020 in Maricopa County and demanding that the workers stop the count? Help us understand what might be coming on the pike here.
I think from what election workers and experts tell me, the lone wolf is the situation that you can't control. I mean,
Yeah.
I always have when, and like a lot of people who sort of look at extremist movements and whatnot, like kind of take exception at the phrase lone wolf, because lone wolves don't just
Mm,
sort of like spring out of
right.
the
They're
nowhere.
radicalized
They're radicalized by
online.
a system, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. They don't exist in a vacuum, but essentially
Yeah.
it's that. It's an actor, not a particular sort of like, hey, everybody show up to this polling place at this time and launch your bazookas or whatever it is. It's more like
Right.
somebody unpredictable. That's certainly what the people in rural towns in Wisconsin are worried about. Um, the uh, you know there have been steps that have been taken. You mentioned Maricopa County. That kind of stuff's happening in a lot of different places. So um some experts that I talk to say, um actually we're a lot more prepared this time, because an awareness of the threats means that at the very lower level, I mean, yeah, some places are installing bulletproof glass and those fences and
Yeah.
security checks and whatnot. um at a lower level, there's more education. and people are getting sort of like emergency contacts, or
Mhm.
they're talking to the local police beforehand and saying, just in case, blah blah blah. This is happening in a lot of different places.
Mhm.
Um, so, if the worst were to happen and somebody were to sort of like come out and attack a polling place or whatever, it wouldn't be a complete surprise in many places. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It would obviously be like terrible, and very disruptive, but perhaps the damage will be somewhat limited. Um, a- and there's also a huge sort of, I guess, like civil society plans. I've heard a number of different plans, plans for churches and religious groups and like clergy members to show up at polls and diffuse situations, to show up at counts. There's obviously lots of monitoring of this kind of thing by the NGOs and not for profits and think tanks and whatnot. So, it's not as if there's like a completely sort of lack of defense, I suppose. Um, and certainly, I think, I hesitate to sort of give a prediction, right? Because it could all go off without a hitch.
Yeah.
Um, we may see, certainly be. Let's put it this way: there will certainly be instances like we've been seeing some reports of, a couple dozen ballots being stolen out of mailboxes or whatever. That kind of stuff's going to happen because it always happens, right?
Yeah.
Um, on election day. But maybe though the prospect for large scale trouble is going to be, it might just disappear, but
Right.
it might not. It might not. What I don't think is going to happen is we're not going to see a large number of people gather on January the 6th and try and storm the Capitol, right? Because that's sort of the last war. Um,
Mhm.
it didn't work last time. People will be ready for it this time. What's more likely is that sort of individuals take matters into their own hands, or specific things might happen in specific states.
Yep.
Um, depending on what's close, where the count will be delayed,
Right.
and um, you can look at Arizona, you can look at Georgia, you can look at Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And those are places where the rules in place mean that it's going to take a long time, if it's very close, for a winner to be declared in those places.
Yeah, and I want to point out too that just in the last week, a far right figure associated with Mike Flynn has been talking about, getting people to state legislatures in Pennsylvania and in North Carolina to interrupt the allocation of electoral college votes in those places, sort of in a January 6th style way. And then just now today, a U.S. rep from Maryland has basically said, "Oh, North Carolina legislature should just decide right now that their electors have to go for Trump, regardless of who wins the state of North Carolina." Lots of different pathways to constitutional crisis. Really, I don't know any other way
Yeah.
to put it. Mike, tell folks where they can find your work. Obviously, you quite literally wrote a book on right wing extremism. I imagine you're probably working on another one. Tell folks where they can find your stuff.
Right, right now, I'm not working at much other than the election, but my book is called Day of Reckoning. It was published by Pluto Press. It's fairly recent, not completely out of date yet. It was published in May of this year. Um, I think there is a section in there where I do look ahead to the election, and I hesitate to sort of reread it, but most of it is about the last 5 years or so, and really how the far right sort of today in this country kind of sprang up from the roots and the sort of dissolution of what we used to call the alt right.
Yep.
A term that's still heard these days, but sort of
Right.
kind of
They're
not so much.
they're no longer alternative because they're essentially mainstream, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, a lot of the ideas, and of course the voter fraud stuff is like one of the key ideas, right?
right.
That has been mainstreamed. Um, So yeah, and yeah, you can pick it up in any good bookstore
All right, perfect. Thanks a lot for the time, Mike. Appreciate it.
anytime.
Thank you for listening to American Doom. This podcast is just a part of my work as a writer and journalist. To keep up, or at least to try to, because chaos and speed are the two primary drivers of my work, you can subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just search for American Doom there, and you'll find the investigations and stories that I cover. Coming up on my newsletter are more dives into election deniers working as local election officials across the country. This is work I've been doing mostly by myself for the last 4 years, and it's not possible without your support. American Doom is the only place that you'll find reporting on local election denier officials. So if you support this effort to protect against threats to democracy, please subscribe to my newsletter, American Doom, on Substack. Thank you.